Before there was the United Nations, the World Bank, or La Francophonie, there was the British Commonwealth, now just called the Commonwealth. It arose out of the once mighty British Empire and carries with it some of the legacy, good and bad, of that history. Today, it's perhaps best known for its cultural work, such as the Commonwealth Games. But in an increasingly uncertain world, there are those hoping it might have a more vital role to play. Joining us now with more, in London, England, via Skype, Deodat Maharaj, Deputy Secretary-General of the Commonwealth. In Vancouver, British Columbia, James Skinner, Chief Executive of Kanzuk International, a Commonwealth advocacy organization. In London, Ontario, Francine McKenzie, Professor of History at Western University. And here in studio, Stephen Rockel, Associate Professor of African History and Colonialism at the University of Toronto. And I'm delighted to welcome everybody here in our studio and in Points Beyond for our discussion about the Commonwealth tonight. And let's start with this little fact file here as we put some of the background of the Commonwealth of Nations on the table here for our viewers. The Commonwealth today is made up of 52 countries. That's home to more than 2 billion citizens. That's about 30% of the world's population. It is the oldest political association of sovereign states in the world. It aims to promote development, democracy, and peace. All members, whether India with more than 1 billion people or Nauru with 10,000, have an equal say. Canada is the second largest donor, contributing nearly $15 million a year from 2015 to 16. Trade among Commonwealth countries is estimated at more than $680 billion today and projected to exceed $1 trillion by the year 2020. And Sheldon, if we can just put this map up, people will be able to see where the Commonwealth countries are worldwide. There's us, of course, Canada, and then across the pond, the United Kingdom. Not much to speak of in South America, a presence, to be sure, in Africa, South Asia, and of course, Oceania with Australia and your home country, Stephen Rockel. There's New Zealand, also colored. Everything, I guess, that used to be in pink on those maps we grew up with is now in blue. Francine McKenzie, let me start with you. How did the Commonwealth come into being in the first place?
Well, the Commonwealth emerged out of the former British Empire, and it emerged as a process of evolution as well as negotiation amongst its members. So it responded to really ongoing processes of decolonization in places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand in its first phase. So in the 1920s and 30s, people began to talk more about a Commonwealth, and those, as they were called, dominions were distinguished from other kinds of colonies, what were called crown colonies. And then there was another period of evolution following the Second World War, where critically India acquired its independence and then joined what was then called most commonly the New Commonwealth. And then later, if we fast forward to 1965, you get the establishment of the Commonwealth Secretariat and another new incarnation of the Commonwealth.
Good. That's a good history lesson. Deodat Maharaj, we have lots of international bodies, everything from the United Nations to the G20 and so on and so on. In your view, what makes the Commonwealth special?
What makes the Commonwealth special is that we are a family of nations, and we're a country the size of Nauru with 10,000 people, or a country the size of St. Kitts with a population of 55,000 people would sit at the table as a family member and on an equal footing with a G20 country, that's the UK, Canada, or a country like India with 1.3 billion people. So we are a family of nations where every family member has an equal space and equal place at the table.
Well, you know, I'm going to push back on that a little bit because, as they say in the Senate in the United States, you can be the senator from California or the senator from Rhode Island. And yes, technically you both have one vote, but somebody has a lot more schlep than somebody else. Is that the case in the Commonwealth?
No, I would say no, because what happens in the Commonwealth, we have 30 countries that are small states. And what happens in our Commonwealth family of nations is that on the big issues of the day, take, for example, climate change, where Commonwealth heads met on the eve, 1 week before COP21 took place in Paris. The agreement and the climate change statement made by the Commonwealth, which was protecting the interests of all members, especially small and climate vulnerable countries, They were supported by Commonwealth heads in Malta and taken forward and agreed to at Paris during COP21. So that landmark agreement made in Paris that we know as COP21, I mean, the Commonwealth made an immense contribution, and we were delighted that Prime Minister Trudeau was also at that Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting.
In which case, let me ask James Skinner the follow-up question. How powerful do you think, looking at it from the outside, the Commonwealth truly is?
The Commonwealth is, I wouldn't say powerful, you could say powerful, but I would say it's more a developmental organization that promotes educational development, economic development, and social development for the countries within it, especially for the developing nations within the 52 member bloc. So it's certainly got its merits in the world.
And Stephen, well, I don't think anybody's ever been thrown out of the Commonwealth, but Gambia defected from the Commonwealth in 2013 because the government of the day called it a neo-colonial institution. What do you think of that characterization?
Well, I would disagree with that. I mean, there have been some ups and downs along the way, of course, but the Commonwealth is very much an institution of its members. And although the United Kingdom, of course, is the mother of the 52 or 53, the members are equal, as Deodat has said, and the great and the small from all parts of the world are together, and developing countries are sitting side by side the very rich countries.
And you think there really is a sense of equality around that table?
I think there is, because at crucial points in the Commonwealth's history, the smaller nations have actually had a very, very big influence. For example, around the establishment of the Secretariat in 1965, it was some of the smaller African countries had a very big role in that. For example, in the Commonwealth's role in the anti-apartheid movement.
Sure. Francine McKenzie, let me follow up with you on some of that. There is obviously, among some, let's start with Queen Elizabeth II, a great nostalgia around the Commonwealth. However, there is also, others would hasten to add, a litany of misdeeds done by its predecessor organization, the British Empire, and maybe the Commonwealth as well. Care to make a bit of a checklist for us?
Well, I could say that maybe not so much a checklist. I mean, the fact of the British Empire is one that we strive to understand, but certainly there were lots of instances of exploitation and violence, and the imperial era is not one that anyone is eager to return to. And I think in some ways the Commonwealth today has defined itself as the antithesis of what the empire used to be. So for instance, it focuses on the interests of small nations. And it's definitely committed to things like democracy and peace and soft power issues, as opposed to being an instrument of British greatness, which it once was.
Deodat Maharaj, how is the Commonwealth now owning up to these darker parts of its colonial history?
Yeah, what I think, I like to look at the future, and I also like to look at where we are now. I think you made a statement earlier about the state of Commonwealth trade. Intra-Commonwealth trade was around 692 billion in 2013. We expect that intra-Commonwealth trade will increase to 1 trillion by 2020, and by 2030 to increase to a phenomenal 2.75 trillion United States dollars. So there is an opportunity, there is space for every single member. And I think the traditional differentiation between big and small countries are no longer applicable because the global architecture has changed. For example, the Commonwealth country of Nigeria by 2050 will have 500 million people living in it, itself becoming a powerhouse. So I think there is a space and a place for everyone at the Commonwealth, and I'm quite optimistic about the future of our Commonwealth.
James Skinner, let me get you to follow up on that. And Deputy Secretary General, I appreciate your point, but Canada and Nigeria may sit at the same table, and they may be equals at that table, but one clearly has a better record on human rights than the other. And I wonder whether countries that have a shoddier record, James, in your view, on human rights, still ought to have a place at that table.
It's an interesting question, and I'm sure you'll get different answers from different people about that. I'm not so sure about whether they shouldn't have a place at that table. I think they should. I think the key issue here is to work with these countries who have poor human rights abuses, such as Pakistan and Nigeria, and actually try and steer them in a direction whereby they can become more favorable towards human rights and start to become more developed nations economically and socially by working together with them, as opposed to simply shunning them and saying, sorry, you're not good enough, you don't have a place at the table anymore. I think that's the wrong approach. I think the best approach would be to carry on doing what the Commonwealth is doing right now, which I think is an excellent approach, whereby we work with these countries and promote development within these countries as an equal.
Stephen, what's your view on how the Commonwealth overcomes its history of exploitative behavior, particularly on the African continent?
Mm-hmm. Well, the problem is not so much the Commonwealth itself. There are issues relating to the old imperial past which crop up every now and again. As a historian, a major story for us has been the secrecy of the British government in hiding 1.2 million files related to decolonisation and other issues. Actually, a huge trove which has been discovered actually through court action by Kenyans who were trying to get compensation for abuses of the Mau Mau war in 1950s Kenya. And through that court action, it was emerged that there are actually 1.2 million missing files which were kept out of the British National Archives. So there are a few remnants of that kind.
Deodat Maharaj, are there efforts being undertaken right now to deal with the example that Stephen Rockel just mentioned?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any efforts being made within the Commonwealth to look at the issues that were just raised. But when I think about the Commonwealth, I think about Rwanda as a member of the Commonwealth. I think about Mozambique. I think about Namibia. I think about Cameroon. I think about a modern and progressive family of nations working together in a time of considerable uncertainty to lend stability, and is an exemplar, by the way, how we operate in terms of how a global family of nations should function
well,
for
to
the
that
betterment
end,
of mankind.
Yeah, I'm sorry. To that end, let me follow up with Professor Mackenzie. I think people of a certain age, and I happen to be one of those people of that age, certainly remember 30 years ago, Brian Mulroney, our then Prime Minister, using the Commonwealth to frankly lead the world in a fight against apartheid. Can you refresh our memory on how he used that institution to lead that fight?
Well, the last time I think really Canada stood out in a Commonwealth context in such a powerful diplomatic way, it was the example of combating apartheid in South Africa. And Mulroney was able to gather support amongst all kinds of other Commonwealth members, basically to take issue with Prime Minister Thatcher's position, where she did not want to impose sanctions against South Africa. And Mulroney was able to build a large community of support. Well, in fact, the community support existed. He was a very effective spokesperson for that support. He also had very close connections to all kinds of people in South Africa who wanted to offer resistance to the apartheid regime in South Africa. And so there was, for instance, a Commonwealth meeting where Prime Minister Thatcher was livid with Mulroney and others. She felt that she was ganged up on, that this was an association where she could come and talk, I suppose, more informally, but not be held to account in the way that she was. I don't think the Commonwealth has often had chances to stand so strongly in the vanguard of a moral and diplomatic issue as it did with apartheid in South Africa. But in that instance, it did, and it was a very effective forum for Canada to make its position clear and to build a larger community of support.
And 3 decades later, how do you think history regards Margaret Thatcher's decision at the time?
Well, as someone was saying earlier, there will be debate about how you deal with states who are adopting policies domestically that are objectionable or repugnant to you. For instance, on the issue of human rights, do you isolate them, or do you try to get as close as possible and work with them? I happen to think that the position that was taken by Canada and others it can also be open to criticism, but I think it was effective in helping to bring about change that ultimately had to be decided within South Africa.
James Skinner, what do you think Canada gets out of being a member of the Commonwealth?
Well, Canada is obviously, in my biased opinion, one of the greatest countries in the world. Obviously, we have excellent record on human rights, economic development, great educational resources, and we're able to share that knowledge with more developing nations within the Commonwealth. And as such, it allows Canada to sit at one of the largest organizations in the world and have a seat at that table to share these resources and share this knowledge, and also get much more out of it in terms of the knowledge that's shared with them. So I think Canada gets just as many benefits out of the Commonwealth as much as it puts into it.
Well, Deodat Maharaj, what role do you see Canada playing in the organization these days?
Canada continues to play a very important global leadership role, and particularly in the Commonwealth. I think on issues associated with women's rights, human rights, issues associated with advancing gender, on the issue of trade, on the issue of ensuring that small states have an equal space at the table, I think Canada continues to play an important leadership role, and Canada provides, I think, much needed resources as well to advance the work of the Commonwealth in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere.
And James, let me just get you to follow up on that in this regard. Obviously, the United States right now is going through its own unique time in its political history, let's put it that way, an America First agenda. Britain is pursuing a Brexit from Europe. Do you think this presents an opportunity for Canada to play a more robust role at the Commonwealth, and if so, to what end?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, like we say, Canada has got terrific allies, especially in the countries that my organization, CANZIC International, works with, being the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And what we are advocating within these Commonwealth nations is for Canada to create closer ties with the UK, Australia, and New Zealand through free movement, free trade, and also mutual development in terms of security and also foreign policy. So I feel as as you say, the United States is going through its unique political time, and obviously Brexit is occurring, but these are actually opportunities for Canada to reach out to its closest allies and create stronger bonds with them and actually create a more prominent role within the world and the international community.
Stephen, let me get you to follow up on that as well. What can Canada do now, given this moment in history, through the Commonwealth?
Well, I think the democracy and human rights agenda is, of course, an incredibly significant one. That never goes away. That's an ongoing work in progress. Even here, I must say, and next door. These issues are important to all of us. And, Canada used to have a role in the whole decolonization process as well, which is largely finished. So I think democracy, human rights, I think women's issues. At the last Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Malta in 2015, there was a innovation to have a women's forum and a youth forum. And I think these were great innovations. And I think given the huge youth bulge, if you like, in the population of most Commonwealth countries, these are projects for the future.
Mr. Maharaj, what would you like to see Canada do in terms of perhaps a more robust role in the Commonwealth going forward?
Yeah, to start with, just if I can quickly make the point that it's 19% more cost effective to trade within the Commonwealth than out of the Commonwealth. So I think there are many opportunities for a country like Canada and others, because on the 10th of March, Commonwealth trade ministers will be meeting, and we would be keen and we are interested in boosting this Commonwealth trade advantage from 19% to around 30 to 35%. And we think Canada can play an important leadership role in helping the Commonwealth support some of the most vulnerable, smallest and weakest countries. So we would like to see Canada participate in the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation and indeed in all of our activities.
Again, Mr. Maharaj, I'm going to push back a bit on that, because Canada right now, even among its own provinces, doesn't have anything close to free trade, and there are all sorts of barriers that protect domestic markets against other domestic markets within the country. Therefore, how does Canada, poor choice of words here, but it's what's in my head, how does Canada get off telling anybody else how to improve their trade relations?
Well, I can't comment on internal issues within Canada, but what I can say, though, is that there are immense opportunities for Canada, for the Caribbean, for Africa, for Commonwealth Asian countries, and indeed the UK going forward. And we should all seize and take advantage of those opportunities.
Okay. James, let me bring you in on this issue of, I hope I'm saying it right, CANZIC International. Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom, the acronym, obviously. What are you guys advocating for?
So what we advocate, you were close, it's CANZUK International. So
CANZUK,
Canada,
okay.
Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom. Yeah, not a problem. A lot of people get that wrong. So what we're advocating is for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom to form closer economic, social, and diplomatic ties. So our primary goal is for free movement for citizens between these four countries based on the current free movement protocols that currently exist between Australia and New Zealand under the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement. What we would then do is expand free trade, as combined free trade from these four countries would be estimated $3.5 trillion US. And we'd also work towards security developments through the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance that currently exists between these four countries and the United States of America, and also with the development of foreign policy as well.
What are the barriers that are currently in place that would prevent that which you just described?
I mean, the barriers that are currently in place, I mean, obviously, like I say, our primary objective is freedom of movement. The barriers are obviously the arduous immigration controls between the four countries. We get thousands of emails every single week, pretty much, from people who have a spouse, say a Canadian who has an Australian spouse, and they can't live in Australia with their spouse or their children because the immigration controls are too crazy. I see it myself when I go back to London every 6 months for business, family, and friends, and so on. And I find it bizarre that members of, citizens of member EU countries can go straight through in one single fast-track line, but citizens of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have to queue up in a separate line, even though they share the same language, the same culture as us. To me, it's kind of bizarre. We share far more with these countries than we do with the European Union. So there's plenty of barriers in place that CANZUK International wants to break down, and we're committed to doing so, and hopefully getting majority, if not all, of these barriers broken by 2020.
Francine McKenzie, I wonder if you could share what you think the odds are of James Skinner succeeding at that, given what we've seen south of the border here, obviously an attempt to put literal and figurative walls up around the United States, and certainly in the case of the United Kingdom and other places in the European Union, a lot less fascination with the free movement of people from country to country to country. What do you think?
Well, a lot of these ideas, it's important to note about for calling for closer cooperation, be it the movement of people or more trade, there have been calls for these kinds of this tightening of associations throughout the 20th century. And there have been various plans put in place to move people around and to bring about free trade. And for the most part, they've been either unworkable bureaucratically, or they've actually engendered tremendous opposition. So if we talk about trade rather than the movement of people for a moment, it's important to remember that despite many attempts to create more trade within the Commonwealth, many of these countries are actually competitors with one another. And so there wasn't that natural complementarity that made them, that made Commonwealth free trade actually realizable or in the best interest of the participants. As for the free movement of people, I certainly hope that the Commonwealth or no Commonwealth countries would go the way of the United States at the moment, but there are going to be all kinds of bureaucratic and economic considerations that will probably make it very, very difficult to work out.
Mr. Maharaj, let me pick up on the trade angle there. For decades, literally for decades in Canada, we have been hearing successive governments talk about the need to expand our trade beyond the market to the south of us, which, does 90% of our business. It's there, it's big, it's close, and despite efforts to increase trade among Commonwealth nations, it really hasn't happened in the way that people who champion the idea would like it to. So the question is there really anything you can do about that?
Well, I think when you look at the trends are very positive. As we speak now, intra-Commonwealth trade is around $700 billion US. By 2020, 1 trillion, and by 2030, 2.75 trillion. It is 19% more cost effective now to trade within the Commonwealth than out of the Commonwealth. So the data would suggest otherwise, that the prospects are good and there are immense opportunities for trading within the Commonwealth. And when Commonwealth trade ministers meet on the 10th of March here in London, that's what ministers are going to talk about, of how do you further boost the Commonwealth trade advantage from 19% to around 30%.
I hear you, but let me follow up. The American border for 80% of Canadians is a 2-hour drive away. Nigeria is a lot further away than that. It's a psychological thing for some people. They just don't think of trading opportunities that far away. How do you combat that?
But it depends on what you trade in. Trade in services would be different from trading in commodities. I think that in the new world dispensation that we have, I mean, you have outsourcing, you have different technologies, you have financial transactions. So I think we have to reimagine trade, to think about trade simply as a construct where you exchange commodities, to my mind, wouldn't be reflecting the very progressive and different world trading architecture that we have now.
Stephen, you think they can make some progress on that?
Well, I think so, because I mean, you just need to look at the fuss the American high-tech industries made over Trump's recent ban.
Suspension.
Suspension, yes. They want free. They want free movement of people as well as access to the technology and so on that are coming out of India, for example. And I think there's going to be a lot more interaction and a lot more trade and a lot, frankly, more movement of people. That's inevitable amongst not only Commonwealth countries, but of course amongst many of the economic players in the world. Just if I may just comment very briefly on Kanzak, I think probably all of us at the table here would like to see some ease of movement of people. But the Kanzak idea is very narrow, and it's a movement of people from 4 countries. And frankly, there are some resonances here that I think a lot of Commonwealth members would be slightly concerned about.
Can I put that to James? You anticipated my next question, which, James, I mean, the 4 countries that you're talking about, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, coincidentally happen to be, at the moment, majority white countries. And there are other members of the Commonwealth, obviously, who might wonder, hey, how come we don't belong on that club? What's the response to that?
It's certainly not because they're white countries. I mean, if we were going to go for a full Caucasian union, we would have brought Cyprus and Malta into it as well, but you'll notice that we haven't. You'll also notice as well that these countries are majority Christian countries as well, but we're certainly not waging war on Sikhism or Islam. These are completely preposterous proposals. The reason we're promoting these 4 countries is that they're so economically and socially aligned. If I can reel them off, which I'm able to do all day pretty much, they share the same head of state, Queen Elizabeth II. They share the same parliamentary-style Westminster system, the same common law legal system, the same respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. They have very good economic growth rates, very good GDP per capita rates, very good methods of tackling unemployment, very good methods of tackling security and counter-terrorism initiatives. The list goes on and on and on as to why these 4 countries would be so good at uniting under free movement, free trade, and foreign policy. There's absolutely no racial issue here whatsoever, apart from a couple of people who just want to, throw out the race card because they know it draws attention when there's absolutely no holding and no grounds for it whatsoever.
So do you see it as merely an ease of travel thing at this moment, or are you prepared to go beyond it with more, a deeper integration?
We're certainly not advocating the integration that we've seen with the European Union. I just want to make that clear. I mean, what the European Union has done is more, it started off as economic integration with the EEC, and I think that's why a majority of the British public voted into it in the referendum in 1975. However, from June 23rd of last year, majority of British people voted out of it because they saw that it moved from an economic union towards more a political union. The European Union becoming, advancing its agenda for ever closer union and the federalist state, which people in the United Kingdom did not want. A lot of countries throughout the European Union do not want. So we're certainly not advocating that with Kanzak. We never will. What we are simply advocating is for free movement between 4 independent sovereign countries, and it will remain that way, to work together towards free trade and foreign policy for the benefit of their societies and also for their economies as well.
Understood. I'm not sure how often Canadians or people here in Ontario think about the Commonwealth, but we're happy that they have for the last half hour. And we're grateful that all of you were able to help us do that. So thanks to Deodat Maharaj, the Commonwealth Deputy Secretary General, who was on the line from London, England, to James Skinner from Vancouver, the Chief Executive of Kanzak, which I will now pronounce properly, Kanzak International. Francine McKenzie at that other London, Ontario. She's a professor of history at Western University there. And Stephen Rockel, Associate Professor in African History and Colonialism at the University of Toronto. Good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It
was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.